we're back with more fluids, and this is going to be quite similar to the tutorial that I posted last week, but today we're going to be doing it with fluid logos. So we're going to take a similar setup, but we're going to do it within whatever object you want. And you can see I've done one with the Google logo, one with the Apple logo, and they're super fun. These are things I've done in the past for numerous brands as well. So we're going to dive into this. If you haven't seen the last tutorial and you're super new to particles, I would suggest going and watching that first and really getting familiar with everything that we're doing here, and then coming back and even expanding on it here. And of course, a couple of things to plug before we get started. One thing I do want to go over is when we're using logos like this, it's quite important to have the meshes set up correctly so we get accurate collisions and they all go down well. And actually on my Patreon here, if you're a member in the Discord, there is different brand logos here. And I added these recently because I've been using them on a bunch of different cloth simulations and whatnot. And there's PlayStation icons. Those are the ones from my old tutorial. And they're nothing crazy. They're nothing special, but it might just save you 15 minutes of drawing in Photoshop and then exporting it and then doing this whole thing because they're already meshed and already ready to go. So if you hop in the Patreon, you can get those. And I'll be adding a couple of the ones from what I've been using today as well. And I also want to mention as well that I did do an extension of last week's tutorial over on Patreon where we took an even deeper dive on different art direction techniques and how we can just kind of make it crazier and bigger and better. So I'd recommend checking that out. Also, I've just posted a really cool tutorial where we make these super cool liquid gooey simulations using the fluid mesher, and I was doing it with PS5 controllers and Xbox controllers and getting tons of bubbles in there, and that was a lot of fun. And I've also done a tutorial on the lighting of those scenes separately. So go check that out. As always, the first 5 people that hit the link in the top of the description will get my Patreon for free for a whole month. But if you miss that for like the first 24 hours after this tutorial goes live, there will be a discount code to get 50% off. But what we're going to be using today, I'm going to use this Nike typo. I think using a bit of typo for the tutorial will be really, really cool because I can imagine that's what a lot of people will want to go for. You might want to use your own logo, or maybe you're on a client project. Whatever you're doing, I think this is quite an appropriate logo. So this, once I mesh this, and we'll go through all the steps, I'm not going to leave anything out. That'll be on the Discord as well for you to download if you want this one. So ideally, if you're starting from any kind of logo, and you might even just be doing this with shapes. If you're doing this with any kind of primitive objects and putting them in objects, this is going to be way easier for you. But if you're doing it with any kind of logo, we need to make sure that we set this up correctly, otherwise you're just going to run into a bunch of issues. So the first thing I'm going to do, I usually like to duplicate that and hide it. And that's in case I do want to go back to the beginning. We're going to connect those paths up and we're going to drop it in an extrude. And some people might think this is enough. But there's an issue here. There is absolutely no subdivisions. And even if we add subdivisions, that's not quite going to work. We need faces on the front and the back. And ideally, we would want more quads here as well. So even adding a few here might help us in the instance of remeshing. But realistically, it doesn't really matter. What we're just going to do is immediately make it editable. And I'm going to drag it out of that null. And we're going to drop in a volume builder. So if you watched my RBD tutorial on PS5 icons way back on my Christmas calendar last year, we did the exact same thing with those PS5 icons. And this is generally what you want to do when you're doing simulations, especially in something like Xparticles. Xparticles is actually really sensitive to the density of your mesh when it comes to collisions. I'm going to drop that voxel size all the way down to 1, and this might even be too big. But also this doesn't really matter, we're just putting a bunch of particles in it. So we don't need the shape super duper accurate. We don't really need to worry about the way that mesh looks, although I probably will make a very lovely version for people that are using it for other reasons. Next up, we're going to grab a volume measure. So you can see already that's meshed. We're back to geometry and we've got perfect quads all over it. So everything's going to collide really well, but we don't want it that ugly, even if we don't want it perfect. Let's drop in an SDF smooth. Let's drop it to around 50%. I'm going to add an extra iteration. I'm going to lower the voxel distance by 1. And this probably would be workable, but I'm going to lower it a little bit more. Let's come down to 0.5. This is probably an amount that I'm happy with. We've got pretty big bevels there, but for what we're doing today, I think this is probably manageable. We have a look at the mesh. It is relatively dense. We could just relax the SDF smooth a little bit. That, of course, is going to make it tighter. And we don't, for this specific scenario, really need to worry about jaggedness in the mesh actually looking perfect because, like I mentioned, we're just putting particles in the middle. So again, we can make that editable. And then what we're going to do now is, actually, usually I would remesh this, and I still am going to remesh it, but at the density we're at, we probably wouldn't need one. And the reason I'm just going to remesh that is because when it comes to the volume builder, You can see there was kind of like patterns on the front, like squarish patterns and whatnot. When you remesh it, it's just going to make everything super duper even, which again is kind of going to give us that insurance that everything's just going to work the way we want it to. And you can see now it's remeshed. Those sort of patterns on the front are gone. What you do have to look out for after the remesh, though, is some funky bits on the mesh. You can see there's kind of like a bit poking out down there. There's like a weird little bump. As long as there's no tears or anything, we should be pretty good. And the density of this shouldn't really slow down the simulation too much. I'm not too worried about it. For now, we'll move forward with this. What I am going to do, though, is duplicate that volume measure 1, turn it off. I'm going to throw it back in that folder. So if I do want to go back to it, I can remesh it again or whatever. But then again, there's a couple of steps to get back there. So if I'm not happy with it, it's usually easy to repeat the process. I'm going to make that editable. We're going to call this Nike_spawn. So we have a logo. Now we're going to spawn some particles in it. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees because what we want these kind of sloshing about, and we want the bottom of the logo to be the floor. Let's drop in a mesh emitter. Now, if you look at the mesh emitter now, there's actually this new setting. Is if I drag in this Nike spawn, I'm going to put the mesh emitter in the particle group. We change this to volume because we're going to want to spawn on a volume. And if I turn off the Nike spawn, go to properties, turn off the speed, and I shoot 10,000 particles, so that'd be 2 more zeros. I'm going to change my frame time to 333 here. And I just spawn in a couple of particles. Well, 10,000. You can see here we're spawning in the volume, but you can see this sort of randomness. We have this new setting now called grid, which, if you remember from last week's tutorial, is going to make the fluids behave way better. We don't really want particles intersecting with each other on frame 0. That's going to cause liquid to do quite funny things. So we want to spawn in on this grid pattern. Now, there's a couple of things that are controlling the amount of particles, but also the accuracy that we have here. So the count, of course, is controlling the count. Let's push that up to 100,000. But on the voxel size here, and you can see if I play again, we're not seeing any more particles. And that's because the voxel size is inhibiting that. So we want to lower the voxel size, and that is going to create more voxels, which is going to create more of those grid patterns, which is going to spawn in more logos. I would suggest coming down between values of 1 and 3 for final render, depending on the amount of particles that you want. Again, this goes over what I went over last week, where you really want to think about at this stage the art direction of your scene. Do you want a slightly lower particle count, which means bigger particle objects, which can look cool, or do you want a really high particle count with smaller particle objects, which again will look really cool? And what I'll do right now is show, I did this on my Patreon tutorial, and I'm going to do it again here, as I will show 2 different instances. One on the left, very, very high particle count. One on the right, lower particle count, but the particles are bigger. Both look good in their own way, but you really have to kind of know which one you're going for. Higher particle counts doesn't necessarily always mean better. It depends on your art direction and what you want. Sometimes the bigger ones on a lower count look cooler. You never really know. So if we have a look at this now, let's have a look at the way we're spawning these particles. If we come back to this logo here, you see they're not really breaking up. They're kind of spawning a little bit everywhere. We need them to be spawning in between the words. This isn't great. We don't want this. This isn't actually an issue I've faced with any of the logos I've done yet, because I've just done a Google logo or an Apple logo, and there's a very simple objects. This is a little bit more complicated, which I wanted to do for the video. That's coming down to the voxel size. If we just lower that to 1, again, that's going to make it more accurate. So that voxel size has really got a lot to do with the shapes you're working with and how accurate you need it to be. For example, if you're just doing this in a cylinder, you might not need the lowest voxel size ever, but to unlock the right amount of particles, you're still going to want it pretty low. So that's looking pretty accurate. If I turn that back on now, you can see that's looking pretty good. But here's where things get a little bit messy and a little bit irritating, and this is where you really want to think about the kind of logo that you're using. If you're using logos like this thick typo, or the Google logo, the Apple logo, all of those sorts of things, you're going to have an easier job with this. If you're using something like the Starbucks logo and you have a really, really hard time, you're kind of asking for it. So what we need to do now is we need to get these particles dropping on the floor of the Nike logo and then swirling about. But we need them not to escape at the logo. And the way that I would usually do this is I would have a night spawn, I would have a spawn logo, and then I would have one just slightly larger that's the container for it. But when you're doing that with logos, that can make the process of making your logos quite a bit more irritating, and you can't actually get around it without doing that. So we're going to try and get around that. What we're going to do, though, before we worry about any of that, is we're just going to drop in a couple of different things. If we come to modifiers, I'm going to drop in a color mapper, and that's going to help us visualize. You've seen this in all my particle tutorials. It's going to help us visualize the particles a lot. I'm going to change this to velocity. I'm going to change it to velocity magnitude. I'm going to set the upper to like 250. And then we're going to drop in a gravity. Let's put the gravity at the top. Color mapper, those sorts of things can stay way down the bottom. Then let's drop in a turbulence. We'll put the turbulence below the gravity. I'm going to set the strength to 45. I'm going to set the scale to 50%. Now, if I just go to simulation tags and drop in a collider, which means we're also going to need modifier collide. Let's put that right at the top. That's important. Keep it right at the top. Collision iterations, blah, 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 blah. You've got all this stuff here. There's one more thing we need, of course. A liquefy. This is a fluid tutorial. Let's just put that one step below the collide. I'm going to turn off use default radius, and I'm going to set the density down to 200. I'm going to set the viscosity down to 0.01, the surface tension down to 0.01. That should do us for now. In the collide, if we go to our collision tag, this is actually where we want to be. I was looking at that one for a second, but we actually want to be here. You're going to want to set the collision side to both. And then in the liquid collisions, this stuff's quite important. Of course, this is already set to volume. We want this in volume. And in the collision side, we're going to set that to inside. And that's quite important. So now if we hit play, we're going to have the gravity, we're going to have a little bit of turbulence, we're going to have the color. And let's just see how these collisions are. And you can see off the bat, I've actually not lost any particles. And that's what you're going to generally see when you're doing colliders like this. You're spawning particles within things, is particles might escape. And just by doing that, we've not lost any. And that's just by setting up the collider tag appropriately. We're going to not really want any friction. We're going to want a bit more bounciness. But you can also see this issue's back, where all of a sudden now the particles are going in between the logo again. Now this is actually a similar issue to what we had before, but this time it's the voxel size inside the collider tag. So what we actually need to do is drop that down. So if we bring this down to 0.5%, and we hit play again, but what I'm actually going to do before I hit play, I'm going to drop this to 50,000, say. And that's just going to help keep things a little bit speedier for now. And you can see that has fixed that. We are now getting accurate collisions around the words. And that's pretty much what we want. Now, for the most part, that is kind of the difficult part over. What we can do now is have a little bit of fun, mess with the turbulences, and just kind of art direct this to a good place before caching. And there'll be a couple of little things we want to go over. Of course, just like last week, we're going to kind of want to watch out for particles on the floor. That just doesn't look very appealing, so we're kind of going to want to build a bit more density up there. And we're going to kind of want to get these particles flowing well as well, and get some good movement in there. So let's go to the particle group, let's go to draw. Let's hit draw radius, let's drop that as low as it can go, which is 0.001. Back in the emitter, I don't think there's anything else we really need to change. We need angular velocity. I'm probably going to do this with rocks or cubes again. Let's set this to random and set it to about, I believe, we have the normal angular velocity here. Set this to maybe 25 degrees. We may have to change that later on. We'll have a little look. But 25, you kind of want to go a little bit higher with this. You can maybe experiment with 50. I believe mine was around 25, 50. But I'm going to leave it on 25 for now. Turbulence-wise, we have one turbulence on a scale of 50% with a strength of 45. That's creating quite large waves if we really think about the object here. We most likely want a mixture between, and I went over this last week as well, you kind of want some large waves driving everything. But then you want more turbulent patterns in there as well. So that's what we're going for. This can be our big turbulence. Big turbulence. And I'm going to duplicate that. Let's set the scale to something like 20%. Let's set the strength to something like 50. But then on the big one, I'm going to lower that to 30. 30 on the strength. And then we can call this one small underscore turbulence. And if we give this a play now, the only thing that's left is some of those density issues, which I believe a lot of is going to be coming from that particle count. But what I'm actually going to do as well is we went over this, we've got the spawn. Another reason I would create a separate object and call this a collider. Nike collider. And let's take off that collision tag from the first one. Is if I just made this a little bit taller. And if I come into this object, go to basic and turn on X-ray. Let's say I go to my F3 view and I just kind of move it up there so you've got a bunch of height up there and a bit of height at the bottom. Now the particles are going to spawn in, drop down, and they've also got more room above the initial spawn as well to kind of slosh about and do their thing. Now ideally, like I mentioned, in the most ideal scenario, you'd probably want an inset of the logo, so it's kind of got room on the sides as well. But like I said, you can kind of get around it without any issues, so it's not much of an issue. You hit play now, you get all these particles, and they're going to drop further now, so you're going to get more of a violent splash at the beginning, which is going to carry more velocity into the rest of the simulation. You can see already that that movement is much more aggressive. It's much more like what we want. We've got full density there now, no seeing the bottom. What I do think is nice though, is if you look back at my Google one, or my Apple one, is it kind of rips away from the sides a little bit, and kind of shows that these particles are actually filling the logo. And I really like that. For this one, I'm not too sure I'm that bothered about it. But in a lot of logos, that can look really cool, because it can kind of show how spaced out it is. But what we also want to look out for here is I want this really, I want the particles to feel really oceanic. I want them to feel really light and splashy. And that was the same effect I wanted last week, and I would want this again on this one, which really comes down to tweaking the surface tension and those viscosity parameters, which I think for the most part we already have pretty well here. I think the only thing is despite the amount of particles that we have, they maybe feel a little bit too big. The way we're representing them at the minute, where we're drawing the radius, is showing us the size of the objects as they would come in render. And this is probably a little bit too big. So like I mentioned earlier, and I showed you the examples, where do you want this to land? Do you want the bigger objects or the smaller objects? And I think for this, I want smaller, somewhere in the middle. So if we go back to properties and we go to radius, what if I set this to 0.5? So that's half the radius of what they're at now. What we're going to do is look at that and see if we need a higher count of particles. So you can see now they're much, much smaller. And you can see we're actually also getting those gaps now. So I kind of summoned that by mentioning them, because now they're there. But if we come down now, look how flat that is. That's not very nice. So what we can do now, let's bring up that count to say 250,000. And this shouldn't add too much calculation time. And we have a look now, and that's better, but still probably not quite close enough yet. There's maybe still just a little bit low down, and then go on a little bit more density. So let's add another 100,000. And you can see now, pausing in this frame, we've got a little bit more improvement. This is probably fine. I would probably be more than happy with this. If we have a look at this in our top view, you can see already, you can feel the potential of how nice this render is going to look. So I'm going to save this here, and this project file will be available on Patreon. But, for this tutorial, I want to go a little bit deeper. And one thing that's cool about going on this side more of a higher particle count, which means, of course, each particle needs to be smaller to represent that, is that if we do that, this whole thing of liquid, the liquefy, and the particles behaving like liquid is going to become so much more obvious. It is going to look so much more like liquid. You're going to see little splashes way more. Everything about the resolution of the simulation is going to go up. Not just the amount of particles, but the amount of movement that you see, and the amount of turbulence that you see, and the splashes and the disconnections between the cohesive particles. All of that is going to go up. So I'm going to pause this here. I'm going to put this version of the project file up. Now we're going to take this into slightly deeper territories. We're going to make the particles even smaller. We're going to put in way more particles, and that's what I'm going to use to render with later on. And I will also put that version of the scene up as well. So if you're happy with this, definitely skip ahead to the chapter where I'm working in Redshift. See how it looks, have fun with it. But if you want to go deeper, then let's go deeper. So if we come back to the beginning, let's set the radius to 0.25. And in the emission, let's come up to 750,000. That might be enough. But again, it's going to come down to that density and how nice that looks. But that whole problem of them sort of sloshing about at the bottom when you are on really, really high particle counts begins to solve itself a little bit. So I'm going to play through this and we'll have a look. But I'm quickly going to Control-Z that, save the scene, and then do it again because I forgot to save the scene. Okay, so we're back up. 750,000, radius 0.25. Let's see how this looks. So here we are, 27 frames in. Not all the particles have dropped yet. We are very, very close to the floor, but you can already see the increase in density and quality there. And you also have to remember that the first kind of 30 frames of the simulation or whatnot is going to be a write-off anyway. We're going to take that away with the Alembic. That particle size, though, is something I'm really happy with because I still want to add that complexity where we have a little bit of variation. And you can see here, the particles are... they're looking okay, but I don't think I want them that thin on the floor. So what I might do is stick with this count, but just bring them up ever so slightly. Let's try 0.3 there. And let's maybe just go to 800,000. So that's an extra 50,000 particles. We'll play through that. So here we are, 35 frames in. This is quite slow. Very thin on the bottom. I might just take a chance with it. I'll have to see. But I don't want to do it and then it looks ugly. Just in my experience it does. But like I said, with these really high counts, you definitely don't notice it as much. It definitely doesn't look nearly as bad, especially with the amount of light and shadow that's going to be caused by the turbulent parts of the simulation. And if you've watched last week's tutorial, you remember that, and you'll remember that that's quite important here, is that we really want a lot of different kind of wavy patterns going on. If your particles end up too flat in their movement, you're not really going to see much when you light it, and it's going to look quite boring. So if you look at this from a flat angle, you really want to kind of see hills and terraces and a lot of movement if you were thinking of that as a terrain, because when you pop a light above that, that's just going to look a lot nicer. Only thing I'm a little bit concerned about is the amount of particles that are kind of sitting up around here, because if I hit play, as long as I'm seeing them moving down, which they're not, they're almost going up, I'd be happy, but they're seem to be going a little bit too crazy. And this could just be to do with what I wanted, with the particles not being viscous and being very crazy. And the angle where we look at these is from above most of the time. So I don't know how concerned I am about this. But you can, see they're starting to drop now. It just seems like particles getting flung about from the initial velocity and a bunch of other things. If we come to the top angle here, you're not really noticing them anyway. And usually this is just what happens when you're dropping particles in. We could just increase the friction a little bit in the collider, reduce the bounce a little bit. I think I'm going to give this a go, because you can see immediately those thin parts are kind of getting puffed back up again. We've got the kind of bits breaking up around the edges where it's not quite filling up. That's really what I like as well. I think this will be nice to see how we can do a render with. So we'll move into caching in a minute. I'll save this. I probably will just drop that bounciness a little bit. And bring the friction up. I'm going to leave the friction where it was. This I'm pretty much happy with. The only other thing I'm going to do is if we come back to frame 0, you can see here the particles are dropping all the way down here. I want them near the center of the world. So I'm going to bring up the bottom right there, just so they're sitting in line with that red axis at the bottom of the world. We're going to make sure this is centered as well. You can see we're completely centered here. If we have a look here, doesn't look quite centered. So if we axis center the spawn and the collider, and then we move that to, well, if we just go into the coordinates here and we set the x to 0, that's more like it. So everything's completely centered now. That's going to solve a couple of compositional errors you may run into, and I would suggest doing that with any logo. But what I think I'll do is cache this, and we'll make a very similar render to what we made last week. Okay, so after a quick cache there, and play through this, you can see this looks really, really cool. You can see very fluid type movement. That's the kind of movement that we want. And it looks really cool in these logos as well, because when you do it in these logos, it really gives tightness to the movement. It makes it look really, really cool as opposed to like a big box. The only issue is these particles I spoke about, these ones flying up. I've done this massive cache now. I'm most likely going to do the render with this big cache, just so I don't have to cache it again, because it was like a 40-minute cache, right? But I'm going to solve that for you anyway and show you how to get rid of that. So, because of course you don't really want that in final render, it's not going to look nice. There's a couple of moments here where a bunch of them kind of bug out and jump up together like that. And whenever you see something like this, whenever you're making particles, and you've got the particles kind of following systems and doing things, nearly in most cases, something like this is occurring because of substeps, and you need more substeps to get rid of it. There could be an argument here that the way these are layered might be having an effect. Maybe we want the liquefy first, and then the collide, or the liquefy, the gravity, then the collide. That could have something to do with it as well. But either way, this is going to fix itself with a larger amount of substeps. But we're going to go over a couple of things. If I take off the cache, we come back to frame 0. I do Control D here. We go to Particles, Substeps. Bring this up to something like 5. That's immediately going to add more calculations between each frame and make everything smoother. That's going to get rid of a lot of that. The other thing as well, which I meant to add, which for some reason I forgot, was a friction. So if we drop in a friction here and maybe put it just above the turbulences, and we set this up at 25, that's going to make everything just sort of a little bit smoother and give it a little bit of drag and make things a little bit less erratic. So if I attempt to play through this now, you're going to see by about frame 20 or 30 that most of those stray particles are going to be gone. You can see these are looking a little bit calmer now. The friction would be something to mess with, kind of going up and down. You might not want it all the way up in something like 25 because you don't want to lose too much of how aggressive this is in that movement, because this looks really nice. And I mean, it all depends on what kind of simulation you want, of course, but I like this a lot. But like I said, I'm just going to do my render with these ones. Although comparing this to the ones I just showed you, the uncached ones, definitely mess with the friction because you don't want to calm this down too much. So you might want this maybe 5, 10, 15. All depends on the kind of simulation that you want. But like I said, you want to get rid of those crazy particles. But the movement here is really, really nice. So, you know, there's an up and down scenario there of finding a happy medium. But the main goal there is to get rid of all these kind of crazy particles. But you don't want to sacrifice too much of that nice movement that we've got going on here as well. What we're going to do now is from here, let's jump into doing a couple of renders with these. So I'll move on with this scene, and like I said earlier, we'll do a very, very similar simulation to what we did last week. So we're jumping into Redshift now, and this is actually about a day later from the last part of the recording because I lost the Redshift part. It bugged out and had some sort of weird seizure. So that recording is gone. I'm re-recording it. But the bonus to that is I now actually have a final cache with the substeps higher, and I've got a render out with it now. And I suppose that works out better. You can see that bit where it splashes up there. It looks much neater. So that'll be a bit better for the tutorial after all. So we'll get Redshift on the go. And it's actually interesting, like, doing this tutorial with the Nike logo, because I've done a bunch of fluid logo simulations with X particles and whatnot, and I thought that this tutorial only made sense following up from the previous one I did. But usually I don't really go super off the cuff in my videos. So I haven't actually used the Nike logo yet. I've only done the Google one and the Apple one to prepare for the video. And then I thought, you know what, I think the Nike one will just look cooler. And I definitely think it does. So it was interesting to kind of find the workarounds on the go with it. But nonetheless, let's make these renders. So I'm going to drop in a Redshift camera, and this can be a little bit slow and a little bit buggy when we're at this kind of particle count. I'm going to put the camera to 150 millimeters. I'm going to zero out the X, zero out the Z, zero out the H and the P. So we're going to be looking straight down on these particles. Press F1, come back to that main view. And, well, we want this at minus 90. And I'm going to zoom out a whole bunch here. And we have the simulation there. Cool. So we're just going to set up some simple lights and the material. And we'll go over the particle objects as well. I'll probably just use cubes in this one. So we'll drop in a dome light. And I'm going to turn that off in the viewport, which I always do because I just like looking at a grey viewport. You know, you drop in all these HDRIs and then everything goes white and it just makes it a bit difficult to look at. I'm going to turn this off in everything but the camera. So I'm going to keep the camera on 1, everything else goes to 0. And then what I can do is drop in another dome light, and then I can do the opposite. So I can just turn this one off in the camera, and I can set this one like halfway down to grey. So now I've got this one, which would be our background, and in this one, that's our shadows. So you can control them both separately. Lighting wise, you really don't need to do anything too complicated with renders like this. We just grab a light, we'll grab a target, and we're just going to target the particle group. And we're going to push this above the logo, and I'm maybe going to squash it down a little bit, and then move it up a little bit. Maybe a little bit further back. Probably something a little bit like that. I'm going to zoom in. Now this is a later version of the scene that I stripped back to redo the recording. So if you come to your render settings here, you're most likely going to be on 1280 by 720. I'm going to be working in 2K, so 2560 by 1440. But I would also just recommend working in whatever you find is the snappiest for your machine. So already, things are looking quite good. And you've heard me go over this a bunch of different times in different videos, and your particle objects really do matter. I like using little stone models, like the ones from JSG or some ones from Polygon. But generally I also like using cubes as well, because they catch light in different ways. And that's why we add the rotation data, because at the minute you can see that they're just little balls. And that doesn't matter if the particles are rotating or not when they're just little balls, because you would have no way of being able to tell. But when we add any other object, you can see the particles rotating, and I think that makes it more interesting, especially when it comes to adding particle variation in size and adding detail. So I'm going to show you that quickly, and you're going to see how much that really boosts the fidelity of everything. So I'm going to drop in a cube, and I'm going to put this in a null ahead of time, and we're going to put this to the size of 1. We can shove it all the way off to the left because we don't need to see it. Now I'm going to duplicate this cube. And I'm going to duplicate it again and again. And then I'm going to grab all of those. So I've got 4. I'm going to duplicate them. I've got 8. I'm going to grab all 8 of those. I'm going to duplicate them again. So I've got 16. Duplicate them again. I've got 32 cubes in this null. And if I come down to the particle group, when we go to render and RS object, and we come to the particles tab here, and we select custom objects, the reason we're creating so many duplicates, because if you imagine I put 2 cubes in here, and one of those cubes I make 5 centimeters, and the other one's 1 centimeter, I would assume that that means that 50% of the particles are the cube that's 1 centimeter, and the other 50% are the cubes that would be 5 centimeters. So when we add 32 cubes, you can imagine how much that offsets and brings it down. So when I want to have all these cubes 1 or 2 centimeters, but like one of them 5, you know that that number is going to be much less, so you'd keep duplicating and offsetting it. And you would think that putting it to random increases that even more, but it kind of doesn't, unfortunately. So I'm going to grab all of these now, and I'm going to pop them in there. And I was noticing some weird bug as well, where I don't know if it was something to do with the objects that I was using, but when I kept putting my particle objects in a null, you saw this in the last video, it wasn't working. But I have noticed with most objects, if I put it in a null first, it works. So we've got all the cubes there now. Now let's say I take this bottom cube and I make it 3 centimeters. So now 31 cubes are 1 centimeter, and then one of them is 3 centimeters. And you can see now already there's a bunch of them that are much bigger, and that adds a little bit more detail. I don't want them that big, so what I'm going to do is set those ones to 2, and then I'm going to grab these 3, and I'm going to set them to 1.5. So that's a little bit more like it, but I'm just going to grab one more, and I'm going to do 2.5 on that. So not quite 3 centimeters. I'm going to do 2.5. So just kind of with these like bottom 5 cubes, just adding some different sizes in there is enough to create a huge amount of variation in the particles. So now what we can do is pop a material in here and take advantage of that color data. So if I double click here, grab a material, I'm going to select all my cubes, I'm going to right click on the material and I hit apply. So then that goes on every single cube in the scene. Then what we're going to do is add a color user data into the material. I'm going to go presets, particles, particle color. Now generally you're probably not going to see that load straight away, so you have to restart Redshift here by hitting this button. And that's going to show up the color data, which is a little bit annoying, especially if you're on the heavier end of a simulation. But unfortunately, that's just what you have to do. So you're going to see that blue and white color come in now, and you can see the different particle sizes even more. And you can see just that extra little bit of detail as opposed to having them all one size. Now what I do to control the color is I just pop in a ramp here, and I play with the ramp. Now what I actually ended up doing for my final render was going for this sort of a very nice color combination of a darkish green. Now I was quite close to yellow, kind of like a khaki color. Something like this. I got really pushed this up to see it. And then I went into a yellow. Something a little bit like that. But I had the yellow going into a white. So there was some white in there. This could have been the other way around though, so probably a little bit more like that. And then I had a lighter green just before the darker green as well. So something, yeah, a little bit like that. I think the lighter green was a bit more closed off, or again, that was flipped. And that was what I ended up doing for my final render. I thought that looked really cool. So what's left to do now as well, before I mess with any of this anymore, is to set up our LUTs and our camera and get all of that looking good. So left over from the scene as well, because I had just removed things out of this scene, my LUT was already plugged in. So these LUTs are available in my Discord. I've mentioned it in videos before. I didn't make the LUTs, I found them on the forum. They're absolutely awesome. They're just photographic LUTs, but they're available there. So I've got one of them plugged in on not super high strength, maybe only like something like 0.4, and then in your color controls. And then in your color controls, you're just going to want to enable that, and you're going to want to pull it down a little bit in the shadows, pull it up a tiny bit in the highlights. But then what's left to do is to come to our Redshift camera, go to color correction, enable tone mapping. That's going to balance out the image an awful lot, and you can just bring down the highlights a little bit. And then you can mess with the blacks and the black threshold here, and you could get a little bit more contrast out of the image. Might actually bring the highlights up a little bit. And then saturation, you can boost that saturation and push a whole lot more color out of the knots in the ramp. And then also I would add a bit more roughness to the particle material. And you can see we're seeing through to the white background a little bit there, but you won't really notice that in the animation. But from a distance I thought this was actually reflection, but it's not, it's seeing through to the white background. And that's genuinely pretty much it for rendering. I didn't do much else on my own render. And just going back over the material, of course, I tend to just duplicate ramps and then mess with different colors when I'm working on particles like this. So I don't know, could do a purplish pinky kind of one with some orange in there maybe. You can see how that looks. Maybe purple. That looks really cool with purple, pink and yellow. Well, if we turn that yellow to an orange, that's really cool as well. I actually think I like that with the yellow. That feels very Nike. So does this as well. I think both of those color combinations for some reason to me really stuck out for something that Nike would probably, you'd probably see on some sort of Nike advert. But that's probably it. I'm quite glad I got to redo this part of the tutorial with the updated Alembic. Just having a look at a couple of other frames here as well, seeing how it looks, which is always good to do. You see that frame looks awesome as well. So if you're trying this with a bunch of different logos, definitely make sure you're tweaking things appropriately, because each logo is going to come with its own set of issues. But like I mentioned before, this project file you're looking at right now will be on the Patreon and my Discord for easier download, as well as the project files from earlier in the video that has much less particles in it. And of course you'll be able to just get this logo as well that I made in the video, which might save you 10 minutes or so. That'll also be in the Discord and the Patreon. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, first 5 people to hit that link at the top of the description are going to get my Patreon for free for a month. But don't worry if you missed that, because for the first 24 hours after this video goes live, there'll be a code for 50% off. And I'll probably make that code Nike for the video today. Thanks for watching. Make sure you tag me in any renders you do with this, because I'm sure they're going to look absolutely awesome. And I love when you guys show me stuff that you've been doing from the videos. Go check out the PS5 Fluids tutorial on my Patreon as well. That'll be up at the same time as this. And there'll be a lighting tutorial following up with that. Thanks for watching again, and I will see you very soon.